I've got a problem with cannabis. And that problem is, I think it's too good to be true. Or so I did until recently. So in this week's vlog, I want to talk about how, despite the fact that I am the owner of a cannabis business, that I have one big problem with cannabis in my head that has prevented me from really fully getting behind and endorsing this plant. So the basis of my beef with cannabis is this kind of too good to be true nature of the plant. Every few months, it seems, there's a new study that comes out that shows evidence that cannabis can treat some new ailment or disease. And while these are all, for the most part, very legitimate studies, double-blinded, done by medical professionals, and I believe them, I still have a hard time believing that this one plant can actually treat over a dozen different diseases. It just blows my mind that there is this one plant, cannabis, that not only can it treat just a couple diseases very well, it might treat over a dozen. And in my mind, that is just statistically improbable, almost impossible in my mind. That there's this one that's just out there that, you know, while we search the globe for all these other cures, there's just this one that can treat 15 different diseases. And to me, it's too good to be true. And I have had a very hard time believing that. This is kind of rooted, I suppose, in my basic understanding of statistics and probability, and my very basic and rudimentary understanding of evolution and evolutionary biology. So what happened last week was I was up late at night perusing the depths of the internet, and I stumbled upon an article on the massroots.com blog. There's an article written by Ocean Melandra. Shout out to you, Ocean, for writing this article, because it got me thinking. And Ocean's article was basically a summary of how cannabis has co-evolved with human beings throughout our history. There is evidence that shows cannabis being cultivated by humans as far back as 5,000 years ago. And what this post got me thinking about was evolutionary biology, and more specifically, the concept of selective breeding. What spurred this was I remembered an old chapter of my high school biology textbook that talked about selective breeding, and what it talked about in the book was not cannabis, but corn, and how corn has evolved through the years to meet the needs of human beings. So I don't know a whole ton about genetics and how different proteins and genes interact to change the existence of biological organisms, but in order to explain this kind of aha moment that I had about cannabis, we've got to understand the very basic concept of selective breeding and how it works. The basics of selective breeding, and in this case as it pertains to corn, work as such. Back 5,000 years ago, we have found that regular corn as we know it today did not exist. But through modern genetics, we've been able to trace the origins back to a grass called teosinte, I think is how it's pronounced, Teosinte. And teosinte is this piece of, it almost looks like wheat that grows on the end of long grass, and it's got 5 or 7 kernels on the end of it, covered in hard shells, and they're very small, only a few inches long, maybe 5 to 8 kernels on them. And what we think happened, we're pretty sure happened, is that human beings figured out that we could eat these kernels and that they nourished us and they tasted pretty good. And so we started making them a part of our diet. So once we started eating this teosinte, we would we also learned that you can take these seeds that we were eating and save some and plant them in the ground later, and they would grow into more teosinte plants. And what we also found was that not all teosinte kernels and pods were created equal. In one given crop, there would be some that were longer, some that were shorter, some had more kernels than others, some would die in extreme heat, some would grow closer together, some would grow farther apart, and these differences across the entire crop would be noted by the people farming them. And when it came time to pick seeds to plant for the next year's crop, the primitive human farmers would pick the seeds and the kernels that came from plants with characteristics most suitable to their needs. So after years and years and generations and generations and generations of farmers constantly picking and replanting the seeds of the biggest, longest teosinte grass, the plant as a species started to get bigger and longer stalks. Over a few 100,000 generations, you take that, and this little teosinte grass will eventually turn into what looks like modern day corn. Okay, so that's the very basics of selective breeding. Now, how does that apply to my theory with cannabis? My aha moment came when I thought about the fact that human beings have been cultivating cannabis for many, many, many years, just as long, if not longer, than corn. Then it's very likely that we applied this same technique to the cannabis plant. And rather than consuming the cannabis plant for food, a lot of times we were consuming the cannabis plant for medicine, to heal us. So if we had done that with corn as a basis for food, it would stand to reason that we could have easily done the same thing with cannabis, but instead of for food, as a medicine. We've been practicing medicine just about as long as we've been harvesting and using agricultural techniques. So why wouldn't we, as a species, use selective breeding with cannabis in the same way that we would with corn? For example, you give cannabis to somebody who's sick back then, makes them feel better. Oh, let's remember that. We replant those seeds. We continue to use that plant in the future. Use it again. Oh, now this plant happens to also fix this one disease. Let's continue using that. And over generations and generations, through human influence, cannabis could have developed more and more healing properties. So the results could possibly be that you end up with a modern day cannabis plant like we have that can cure over a dozen diseases, something that would never have occurred in nature on its own. And that was the basis of my beef with cannabis, is that just given nature out there, the fact that through random genetic occurrence and all probability, you couldn't end up with a plant that cures this many things. However, if you add the human element, where we encourage this plant to develop these curative properties, then it starts to make sense that you could end up with a plant so uniquely capable and miraculous. All right, so that's my whole theory on this selective breeding and marijuana thing. I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for next week's vlog. Check out our website, blog, all that stuff. There's links. So check that out, stay tuned, and we'll see you next time.